Your throat is on fire, your head is pounding, every muscle in your body aches like you've been wrung out and left to dry. You reach for your phone, search your symptoms, book a same-day appointment, and within hours someone hands you a diagnosis and a prescription. Problem solved. Now imagine none of that exists. No clinic, no pharmacist, no antibiotic, no one with a medical degree. Just you, the people around you, and whatever the earth provides. For roughly 300,000 years, that was the only option your ancestors had, and somehow, most of them made it. This is the story of how ancient humans handled sickness, injury, and death, and what they knew that we have almost completely forgotten. Let's start with something that surprises most people. Ancient humans were not, on average, sicker than us. They were different kinds of sick. Paleopathologist Charlotte Roberts, who has spent decades studying skeletal remains across dozens of archaeological sites, found that hunter-gatherer populations show surprisingly low rates of the infectious diseases that devastated later agricultural societies. Your prehistoric ancestors almost never died from measles, smallpox, or plague. Those killers came later, born in the filth and crowding of early farming villages where animals and humans lived pressed together. Before agriculture, your ancestors lived in small, mobile bands. Disease couldn't spread the same way. The group was too small. You moved too often. What killed ancient humans instead? Trauma, infection from wounds, difficult childbirth, parasites, the cold, and old age, though that last one happened more often than most people assume. But here is what is easy to miss. They had medicine, not our medicine. Something older, something that worked in ways we are only beginning to understand. The oldest confirmed medical intervention in the human fossil record dates back at least 500,000 years. In 2023, a research team led by archaeologist Tim Maloney, working at a site called Liang Tabo in Borneo, announced the discovery of a human leg bone with a healed amputation. The cut was clean. The bone had grown back around the wound. The individual had survived for years after the surgery. This was not a lucky accident. This was deliberate, skilled intervention. Someone had cut through flesh and bone with a stone tool, treated the wound to prevent infection, and kept that person alive long enough for their body to knit itself back together, at least 31,000 years before penicillin. Think about what that means. Someone in that group knew how to do this. They knew which plants to use to keep the wound clean. They knew how to manage the pain, and they knew the patient well enough to keep caring for them through weeks or months of recovery. That knowledge did not appear overnight. It was accumulated over thousands of generations, passed from elder to apprentice, grandmother to child, healer to healer. And it lived entirely inside human memory and practice. No books, no schools, no hospitals. Just people watching, learning, and remembering what worked. Ethnobotanist Mormon Daniel, who compiled one of the most comprehensive databases of Native American medicinal plant use ever assembled, documented over 2,800 plant species used medicinally across North American indigenous cultures. Willow bark for pain and fever, the same compound we synthesized into aspirin. Yarrow to stop bleeding. Elderberry for respiratory illness. Echinacea to fight infection. These were not guesses. These were the result of thousands of years of careful observation, trial, and refinement. Your ancestors were doing pharmacology. They just called it knowledge. And they had specialists. Across virtually every ancient human culture that archaeologists have studied, there is evidence of a role we might today call healer, shaman, or medicine. This was a dedicated position, someone who spent their life learning the terrain of illness and recovery. At the site of Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of what is now northern Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Selecki discovered a Neanderthal burial dating back 60,000 years, surrounded by dense concentrations of pollen from medicinal plants, yarrow, groundsel, ephedra, and others that are still used medicinally today. Some researchers debate whether the pollen was placed intentionally or carried in by other means, but the sheer concentration and the specific species involved has led many to argue that this individual may have been buried with the tools of their trade, a healer, buried with their medicine. So let's reconstruct what healing actually looked like. Imagine your camp. Somewhere in the grasslands of East Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago, someone has been injured on a hunt. A deep gash in the thigh, bleeding badly. The first response is fast. The wound is packed, with moss, with spider webs, with chewed plant material. We know from cross-cultural ethnographic research that many independent cultures independently discovered the same antimicrobial. The body is placed near the fire, not in the cold. Warmth matters. Fever is allowed to run its course, because the healers of this world had noticed over centuries that patients who fought through a fever often survived. Water is brought. Food is prioritized for the patient, even when the group is running lean. And this is the part that researchers like anthropologist Kim Sterelny argue is underappreciated. The social structure of ancient human bands was itself a medical system. Cooperation was medicine. Sharing food with someone too sick to hunt was medicine. Sitting with someone through the night was medicine. The group's willingness to invest in a sick or injured member, to absorb their temporary inability to contribute, was the immune system of the whole community. Here is the counterintuitive part. When agriculture arrived roughly 10,000 years ago, human health got worse, not better, worse. Skeletal remains from early farming communities show dramatic increases in dental decay, malnutrition, anemia, and infectious disease. Average height dropped, bone density dropped. The variety of food that your hunter-gatherer ancestors ate, dozens of wild plant species, seasonal fruits, diverse game, and collapsed into a narrow monoculture of wheat, barley, or rice, nutrition cratered. And as villages grew denser and people lived alongside their animals, new diseases jumped species and tore through populations that had zero immunity. The Black Death, smallpox, influenza, these are the diseases of civilization, not of prehistory. Your ancestors did not need cures for them because they did not have them. And yet, we remember history as though medicine only began when someone wrote it down, as though healing only counted when it happened in a building with a name on it, as though the 295,000 years before recorded medicine were just a long stretch of helpless dying, waiting for science to arrive and rescue the species. They were not helpless. They were observant. They were empirical in the deepest sense. They tested what worked on the most important experiment possible: real human lives, across real generations, in real conditions. The knowledge they accumulated did not disappear entirely. It went underground. It became folk medicine, traditional medicine, indigenous healing practices. Some of it was dismissed. Some of it was stolen. Some of it eventually made its way into clinical trials and came out the other side as modern drugs. Artemisinin, the most effective anti-malarial drug in the world, was derived from sweet wormwood, a plant that Chinese traditional medicine had used for over 2,000 years. The Nobel Prize it earned in 2015 was given to a scientist the discovery, in any meaningful sense, belonged to every healer who had ever packed that plant into a wound or brewed it into a tea and noticed that the patient got better. Your ancestors did not survive 300,000 years of sickness and injury because they got lucky. They survived because they paid attention, because they built systems, social, botanical, practical, that were sophisticated enough to hold a wounded member alive for years without a hospital. Because they knew things about the human body and the natural world that took us centuries of laboratories to rediscover. The next time you reach for aspirin, you are reaching across 300,000 years. The willow that gave us that molecule was not discovered in a lab. It was discovered by someone who noticed, long before anyone was writing anything down, that the person who chewed the bark stopped hurting. They were watching. They always were.